is virtual national discussion elevating early childhood education, the benefits of quality education, and how to make it accessible to all children. On behalf of today's hosts, HighScope Educational Research Foundation and Detroit Public Television, welcome. I'm Chastity Pratt. I'm an education reporter and fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. I'd like to welcome today's panelists, Dr. Iheoma Iruka, the Chief Research Innovation Officer at HighScope. Hello, Iheoma, how are you?
I am well, thank you so much. Good morning.
Thank you. Also, let's welcome Stacey Abrams, the guest who has attracted so many of you to join us today. As you know, Stacey is the first Black woman to be a gubernatorial candidate for a major party and is the New York Times best-selling author of the book, Lead from the Outside, How to Build Your Future and Make Real Change. Stacey is going to talk about making real change and her experience with early childhood education policy, and only that topic. Hi, Stacey. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Wonderful. Today, we're going to talk about and focus on how important high-quality early childhood education is for U.S. economic prosperity and what policymakers can do to create a cohesive education system for all young children. In particular, Iheoma and Stacey will discuss how citizens can engage with local and federal policymakers to address adequate compensation for early childhood professionals and what needs to happen to provide equitable access for young children from underserved, low-income, and ethnic minority families and communities. But before we get into the discussion, Iheoma, for those people in our audience who might not be familiar with HighScope Educational Research Foundation, can you please first talk about HighScope and how it became a revered expert in the field of early childhood education?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chastity. So I joined HighScope about 3 years ago, largely because of their groundbreaking para-preschool project, which was led by HighScope's founder, Dr. David Weikart, and the first Black principal in Michigan, Eugene Beatty. 50 years ago, the Perry Project helped to change the trajectory of early child education. And I, along with my HighScope colleagues and many partners, plan to build upon this work through innovative research initiatives to ensure that all children are provided with the best start in life. This is why our conversation today is so important. HighScope is really committed to ensuring that early child education receives adequate attention and funding from policymakers. HighScope's research, along with many other studies and interventions, have proven that high quality early education and high quality early learning experiences improves a child's chances for school and life success. And that the positive impact of high quality early learning experiences goes beyond the child, but also extends to the future generations and communities that they are part of. I'd like to really thank Chastity, Detroit Public Television, and Stacey Abrams for helping us shine a spotlight on the importance of early child education. And of course, for your flexibility to have our conversation virtually. Each year, HighScope hosts a conference where over 1,000 early child educators and leaders from across the globe gather together to learn from each other the best ways to engage young learners in education. However, this year, due to the COVID virus pandemic, we are unable to host our conference where Stacey Abrams was scheduled to be our keynote speaker. So I'm really, really thrilled and glad that you're both well and able to join us today. I want to really link our conversation to the current COVID-19 pandemic, focus on early care education. The COVID-19 pandemic has made visible the importance and essential role early care education and education writ large has for our economy, our community, families, and the children that we serve. COVID-19 has greatly impacted childcare with the potential loss of almost 50% of childcare providers if this is not attended to. Even before the pandemic, childcare programs were operating on a razor-thin margin, and many of our early childhood workforce were earning such low wages with no benefits that nearly half of them were eligible for public assistance. Does this conversation with Stacey Abrams and being moderated by Chastity Pratt is timely. So thank you.
Thank you, Iheoma. And I would challenge all of our audience to look up the Perry School project. It was really groundbreaking in understanding the impact of preschool on people's long-term health and prosperity. So, okay, ladies, let's get into it. But first, let's agree on some terms. Stacey, as the top Democrat in the Georgia Assembly, you at the time worked on bipartisan efforts to save universal pre-K from some budget cuts. So could you talk about how politicians see this topic? Is it a local issue? Is it a national issue? Is it a back burner issue?
I think, unfortunately, first, Chastity, thank you so much. And Dr. Iheoma, thank you for a kind introduction. I think we have to remember that for most politicians, they deal with the people who can vote them out of office, and that tends not to be 0 to 3. And so, unfortunately, while it is a constant conversation, it rarely gets the prioritization it requires. But it's also the most short-sighted set of decisions we can make if we do not give it primacy. If we educate children 0 to 3, prepare them for pre-K and prepare them for kindergarten, we are actually preparing our societies for stronger education, for lower rates of incarceration, for higher rates of productivity, and for sustainable opportunity for those families. What we see happen, though, is that it gets encompassed in this larger conversation of education, and then it gets shunted to the side because the presumption is parents should be in charge of early childhood education, ignoring that cycles of poverty, cycles of lack, cycles of undereducation have prevented the capacity of those parents to provide for their children what they need. But we also know that it's a significant part of our economic system, that we are watching families that have to go back to work, unfortunately, are being forced back to work too early. But when they go back, when they're essential workers, they have to have somewhere for those children to not only be taken care of, but to learn. And the one thing I'm going to point out is that we know that if we do not tackle this issue, 4.5 million children will live in childcare deserts by the end of this pandemic. And because of those razor thin margins, because of that low pay, because of the lack of attention being paid in the CARES package and the upcoming relief packages, unless we have specific investment in childcare and early learning, we are going to watch another generation of children fall behind.
So Iheoma, could you back us up just a little bit? What are we talking about when we say early childhood education? Is it pre-K? Is it, like Stacey was saying, 0 to 3? Like, is it all encompassing? Give us some terms here when we talk about early childhood education.
So absolutely. So first I want to say that one of the reasons we selected Stacey for our keynotes is because of a fight to ensure that Georgia pre-K does not get cut, right? And so pre-K is one aspect of the early childhood education sort of facet. So pre-K is important, but there's many parts to it. Some people often think of early childhood or childcare as just babysitting, but the science is clear about the importance of early childhood education. There's a diversity of programs that range from school-based, center-based, home-based, and even some of our friend and family neighbor care, right, which are not always formalized. So there's a lot of different types that go beyond just Head Start or even early Head Start. So there's a lot of children who are out of home care. So it's important that we begin to ensure that children have the best early years, regardless of the setting, the type, the auspice, etc. So when I talk about it, I sort of see it as programs, services, any learning experiences that serve multiple purposes, which includes parents being able to go to work, providing high quality care, but more importantly, really setting children up for school and life. So really an early childhood is really a space for children who are being cared for and nurtured through a high quality, competent professional in a healthy, safe, and affirming environment.
So you both touched on the issues of COVID, right? Can we talk a little bit about that? Let's dig a little bit more deeply. We know the pandemic has closed child care centers, and that's a pause that a lot of operators might not be able to survive. And Stacey, you talked about the CARES Act. Let's just unpack that a little bit. What needs to be done on the state policy level, the national policy level, to ensure that we have adequate early childhood education, adequate, daycare post-COVID? Stacey, you want to take that?
Sure. And I think we have to start with the current pandemic and move into recovery.
Yes.
Because one of the challenges we have is we tend to skip over the immediacy of need, and that then allows us to ignore the long-term responsibility. And so if we start with the investment that needs to be made right now, the National Women's Center estimates that there should be about $50 billion put in place for the childcare space. And as Iheoma pointed out, that means in-home workers. Those are the folks who, we used to go to Miss Carter's house. That was our childcare. And she made sure that we read, that we learned. We need to make certain that those thin margins that those childcare providers are operating with are not going to lead to their decimation. And unfortunately, we know that those slots are going to disappear if they are not invested in during this process. A lot of those families, a lot of those providers aren't currently eligible for the Paycheck Protection Act. And so they're not getting the resources they need. We need to also make certain that those workers have access to health insurance. Those teachers, those pre-K teachers, those K through 12 teachers get the most attention, but we need to pay attention to the underpaid educators who are usually childcare workers and are pre-K teachers, that they have health insurance and they get subsidized payments. And to the point that you made, Chastity, we know a number of them are also on public benefits. They are taking advantage of our social safety net. Their income should not count against their safety net benefits. The second part is that we have to have federal responsibility, but local implementation. And that's, I think, the other challenge. There's this notion that if we cede it to the federal government, they will fix it for everyone, which isn't true. But they can set standards and they can provide the resources. But on the state and local levels, we need to make certain that we're meeting people at the point of their needs. We know that in rural communities, we already have childcare deserts, where Head Start is the single most effective program, but it's also the single largest provider of any childcare oversight for 0 to 5. So we need to make certain that those investments are made and that those frontline workers who traditionally are still at work, that they are given the personal protective equipment that they need, and that they are being given the supports they need. Long term, we need to plus up salaries. There should not be low wage workers taking care of our most precious people. They should not be having to struggle to reach their own basic necessities while they take care of our children, while they educate the next generation. And so they should be plussed up in terms of making sure that their wages are not just minimum wage, but living wage. They need to have access to health insurance, and they need access to housing, because often what creates childcare deserts is that those who can provide those services can't afford to live in the communities where the services are needed.
So I'm going to come back to that, because we're going to really talk some more about what people can do to make that kind of change happen. But Iheoma, you are in Michigan, you're in Metro Detroit, in the heat of the pandemic, in the heat of educational, early childhood issues as well. Is this a state issue, national issue? How do we address that in places that are having crises, whether it's being a desert, as Stacey was saying, a childhood desert, or just in crisis? Is this something that's a state issue or national issue from where you're standing?
Right. So obviously HighScope is in Michigan, and it is an issue in Michigan and also an issue across the country. We know, as Stacey just pointed out, a study was just done by the National Association for Educators of Young Children and the Center for American Progress, showing that up to 50% of childcare providers may actually not be in existence. And exactly to Stacey's point, you cannot build a workforce where you don't have benefits and adequate pay, especially when making $11 an hour. During the time when we know that children's brain are growing at the fastest pace is during that prenatal through grade 3, and especially during that prenatal through age 3 space. But fortunately, I would say we at least have a great example from Governor Whitmer, who understands the importance of the childcare community. And on April 29th, she announced the Child Care Relief Fund of about $130 million to provide direct, non-competitive grants to childcare providers. And these funds ensure childcare providers currently serving essential workers remain open. that childcare providers can stay afloat during the stay-at-home order, that childcare is actually more affordable for families as our economy begins to open. And childcare providers across the state, from rural to urban and in between, have the resources needed to reopen for Michigan's workforce. Even with this investment, we already know, as Stacey just articulated, that we need probably $9.6 billion a month, right? And we know that the CARES Act won't cover that. And we need to really see the lack of childcare and early education as a public health emergency, right? Many children won't get the services and programs that they need to support their health and well-being. And we know this is likely to impact the poor and marginalized communities. We need to really provide adequate funding, support, and really pay our workforce, our essential workforce, as they have been deemed across the country during this pandemic, especially when we understand the importance of the first 3 years of life with brain development and so much more.
So one more time, what was the name of that that legislation that Governor Whitmer signed and that other governors might consider doing the same?
Absolutely. It is called the Child Care Relief Fund, and it was announced on April 29th.
Gotcha. Wonderful. So what do we do? What do we do beyond increasing awareness? What actions can parents and educators, community activists take to advocate for this kind of increase in funding so that we can have better quality early childhood education? Stacey, what can regular folk do?
Number one, they can complete the census. And I know that seems like a small thing, but the hardest to count communities are people of color, immigrants, rural communities, and children between the ages of 0 and 5. The reason this matters is that we use those numbers to predict investment in Head Start, in SNAP benefits, in our entire infrastructure. It's predicted based on the numbers today. And so we extrapolate as a nation from what we have today to what we need in 10 years. What that means is that if children are undercounted, the resources they need will never show up, but that also hamstrings the children to come. And we end up without enough slots, without enough investment, without sufficient subsidies. And unless we have governors like Governor Whitmer, we end up without the ability to actually immediately respond to crises. The second, so number one, fill out your census. Go to my2020census.gov, fill out your census, do it immediately. Because that number not only controls the economic investment, and I'm going to put one quick fine point on it, for communities of color, the expected undercount, so the number of people they don't think they're going to get to, will cost our communities $8.2 billion every year. That underinvestment compounds. So every year you don't get what you need is a year where you fall further and further behind, and this lasts for a decade. And we've got to understand this is what happened to us 10 years ago, which is why we're in the position we're in now. So fill out the census. That's number one, because it also allocates political power. This is an election year, and the best time to advocate for what we need is when people need our votes. The work that I'm doing, not only with Fair Count, which is my organization working on the census, but Fair Fight, which is working on voting rights, is about the fact that we have the ability to transform the policies that will guide us through recovery. But that only happens if we show up at the polls. And what's going to happen is in this election cycle, we're going to see a lot of different types of campaigning, but those who need to advocate, those parents who are facing losing their jobs because they can't afford to go to work and take care of their kids, they need to be asking the question of every person who wants their vote, what are you going to do to help me? You want to demand that there be subsidies, that the low pay that childcare workers receive be increased, but also that it becomes a national policy that childcare is an essential provision of services. Because when the economy reopens, when people go back to work, if we do not have the ability to protect our children, families are going to be forced to make terrible choices. So make sure you're registered to vote and make sure you hold your elected leaders accountable. And if they're not responsive, fire them. That's what an election is. It's about hiring and firing the leaders of our cities, our counties, our states, and our federal government. We have that power in 2020 in ways we will not see for another 4 years. And so use that power now, because they're a captive audience and you deserve to be heard.
Let's vote. Iheoma, what do you say?
I can do better than that.
what do regular folks do? I know you hear from parents and teachers all the time in the educational community who are frustrated. What do you tell them? What do they need to do?
Well, I definitely tell them Stacey's line, you must vote and complete the census. But in addition to that, I would say that they have to lean in and engage in the conversation, whether you're even a parent or a non-parent, that whatever decisions we make about our young children, who are investments in the future, is going to impact your life as an adult, as an aging citizen, et cetera. And so it's actually leaning in and in that conversation and advocating in many ways, even for those of us who work multiple jobs, non-standard hours, being able to make phone calls, write letters, engage your neighbors. There's a lot that can be done when we actually collectively say, we are in this for our children. We also need it for us to work, right? It serves, again, childcare, early childhood serves multiple purposes. Childcare providers are businesses, so they are an important fabric of our community. Childcare is important for us to be able to work and do all the things that we want to do. And childcare and early childhood learning experiences are critically important for our children. So to me, we have to lean in. And I think ordinary folks, whoever you are, me included, that we can do more by just leaning in, engaging that conversation, learning more, pushing our leaders elected to continue to say, if you care for us and our children and our communities, you must invest in our most important prized possession. As a mother of two kids, I have a 6 and a 3-year-old. When I put them in childcare early childhood programs, they are my investments. And so I expect our country to invest in our children because we know it gives back multiple folds on so many levels.
Chastity,
So, go
Chastity,
ahead.
can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
And I just want to expand on what Iheoma said. I like to think of it in three things. One is speaking up. So often we struggle in silence. We don't tell our story because we're ashamed that we couldn't solve the problem ourselves. And because we struggle in silence, we don't realize that the person next door has the same exact problem.
Mhm.
So our first responsibility is to speak up, share your story, not only with the elected officials, but with your neighbors so that you and with your colleagues so that they understand that this doesn't just impact them or you, but it's a societal challenge. The second is show up. And in days when we actually got to go outside, I would say go to your capital, but in lieu thereof, call, text, email. It's exactly what Iheoma said. Actually, not only share your story with the people around you, but show up in the spaces where your elected officials are and make them understand your story. And the third thing is that we have to hold them accountable. So you speak up, you show up, and then you stand up. And that stand up is by saying, if I do not hear from you, your plan for solving this problem, then I'm going to use that as the reason I vote. And I'm going to tell all those people with whom I shared my story that they should use it as well. We cannot underestimate or we cannot overestimate how important that communal connection is, where people, if you say, this is why I'm going to vote for this person, or this is why I'm not going to vote, because when I told them about this crisis I faced, they turned a blind eye. That's how you get people to be more responsive. That's how you get legislators at every level of government, how you get executives to respond. It's by speaking up, showing up, and then standing up.
So just to put a finer point on that, who is supposed to care? When you lean in, when you go to vote, are we talking about policymakers who deal with budgets in the state legislature? Are we talking about the governor? Are we talking about the mayor? Are we talking, specifically, because there are people who are really ready to engage. And I just wanted to give them a little bit more about who exactly is supposed to care about this and who to reach out to.
Okay, so let's start at the baseline.
Yeah.
Your school board is responsible for the education of children. We tend to cordon that off and say pre-K to 12, but that's in our imagination. Their responsibility is the education of children. And we should hold our school boards accountable for solving these problems. And there are school districts around the country that have expanded to cover 0 to 3. And if you don't live in one of those communities, you should ask why not. Number two, you have to think about your mayor, your county commission. They not only provide services, they also provide facilities. Sometimes the challenge is that people just don't have access to the place to provide those services. And because, as you both said, these are businesses that should get investment from the city and county government to provide the support and the resources necessary to serve the workforce. And so absolutely demand action from your city and county level. At the state level, the state budgets are always anchored by education budgets. And those education budgets have to begin with early childhood development. The extent to which they say, well, we don't really have responsibility except for oversight of childcare facilities, that's not true. They are responsible and the budget should reflect it. But don't just look at the budget, look at the tax incentives. There should be tax incentives for the provision of workforce-driven childcare support. And so make certain that this is being pushed into every part of the conversation. And then ultimately at the congressional and federal level, we want oversight, but we also want investment. And we know that we have already spent trillions of dollars responding to COVID-19 to just meet the moment. But when it comes to recovery, that's when the real work starts. That's when the real dollars are going to be set. Everyone talks about a new normal. The new normal should be we solve this problem for the first time. And our new normal should be that in 2021, whoever is in charge of our country should have the obligation to have a specific policy for how childcare and early childhood development becomes a national initiative and a national priority.
So, Iheoma, HighScope is just full of all kinds of data and research about this topic. Can you talk about what is at stake? Specifically, what happens if we do nothing? What are the data points around the importance of early childhood education that will help people to understand why this needs to be a national issue? What's at stake if we don't do anything?
So I want to sort of highlight that in many places, from conservative to liberal, we do, I think, see that early childhood is viewed as a bipartisan issue. Now, how funding is dispersed and given out, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? So some people just think pre-K. And I think to Stacey's point, we have to really think of it as a life course that it starts prenatally, right? And then into birth and through that, right? So we have to think much more in this long-term sense of it. I don't think we have an option to not care, right? So the do nothing, I don't see as an option because we have articulated and we have found from the pandemic that childcare is essential. So even if we disregard the science that shows the importance of the early years, essentially we need childcare and we need early childhood to function at the highest level because we need our workforce to go to work. So even just based on that simple premise of just needing people to go to work, we need our childcare to function. But we also need it because we know that the investment in the early years is like it's like anything. When you invest early, the returns are pretty amazing. And as Stacey said early on in the broadcast, we know from evidence from the preschool study that children who receive this high quality early intervention in a healthy, safe environment where they would engage in interactions, connections, and collaboration and partnership with families and communities, that had long-term impact in terms of whether it's criminal activity, whether it's education, use of public services, and even health, right? In terms of lower health, negative health outcomes. So we know the impact is really just beyond the 3, 4, 5 years old. So similar to health, we should really begin to see early childhood education really as a right. We provide vaccines to inoculate. It doesn't say that you should never, go out and run and be healthy, but it's to inoculate you a little bit, right, from all potential diseases. Again, early childhood is not a panacea. It's not a bullet, right? It's not a one-size-fits bullet. However, it's an inoculation to begin to ensure that children, right, during, again, the most important critical years of their brain development, of their self-regulation, and all these really important things from language communication, because it is the beginning formation of those important neurons and systems building, we have to get it right. Because if we don't do anything, we could probably understand what the ramifications could be for our economy, our communities, and most importantly, for our families. And we owe it to the children, we owe it to the community, we owe it to our families, right? So early childhood started on the notion that children who are in poverty, marginalized communities, children need to be set up for school and for life success. And so we owe it to children that we actually invest. So doing nothing is actually not an option that at least I can see happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I point people to that study that Iheoma mentioned, the Perry School. It was 30-year long, was it 30 or 40
50
years?
is 50 plus 50 years.
50,
Yes,
it's
over
50
50 years.
this year.
That's right.
It's a
That's
50-year
right.
longitudinal study that shows the differences in life outcomes for children who have quality early childhood education and childcare and those who don't. The differences are vast, and it's a 50-year study. It's the Perry preschool study. I
That's right.
challenge everyone to go take a look at it. We're going to take some questions soon, but first, I want Youma and Stacey, if you could talk about the larger role you see early childhood education playing in strengthening our economy, because there are people, there are voters who don't have children in their families, who don't have children at all, and it's not on the front of their mind to think about early childhood education, but the economy is on everybody's mind. So could you talk a little bit about how early childhood education, the role that it plays in strengthening our economy, especially post-COVID? Stacey?
Well, I would begin by saying, even if you don't have a child, if you have to pick up an extra shift because someone has to miss work to go take care of their child, that child's affecting you. If you are paying more in taxes because we've had to increase the social safety net, if we are paying more in taxes because we have to deal with the social pathologies that come along with undereducation, then that child has affected your life. But the flip side is that the extent to which we actually invest in early childhood education, we see better returns on investment in our entire communities. We see better trained workers. We have people who are better equipped to deliver services and to create new jobs. We have to remember that our economy depends on every generation's contribution. And when we underinvest in any generation, we are underinvesting in the future of that economy. And as people begin to age and begin to retire, you want an educated workforce that can take care of you, that can invest in you, and that can make certain that the economy continues to support your retirement. And so I think we have to not only think about the longitudinal study that is the Perry study, we have to think about the longitudinal connection that is our economy. We are always depending on the generation before and the generation after to determine our success in the moment. And if we underinvest by ignoring the importance of early childhood education, of the provision not only of education, but of promise, then we are underinvesting in who we are. And when we talk about recovery, we cannot let ourselves recover back to what we had before. Recovery should mean that you've learned and do better. And what we should learn is that we must do better by our childcare workers, our early childhood education providers, because they are a backbone of our economy. They allow parents to work and they allow work to be done, which means they allow our economy to function.
Youma?
I mean, I would just add I'll just add a couple of things. One is that we need the childcare in order to actually be able to work. Um, and obviously, like we said already, childcare is also a business. So if we really value businesses, we should also think about the childcare providers who are operating as businesses. And we know from the HighScope preschool study, and similar to the Carolina Abbotsford study, we know that every dollar invested, you get a 7 to 10% return, which is higher than the stock market. So this is an investment. And so we can't just think short term.
Say that
We have,
again. I need you to say that
I
again.
will. I would say it again. Every dollar invested, you get 7 to 10% return, which is higher than the stock market. Again, this comes from Professor Heckman at the University of Chicago. That's what we found, that just this investment in early childhood has long term. So not just short term. So we can think about till end of 2020, but this is about the life of children, but also the life of our country. 7 to 10% return on investments. And we also know that early child experiences is predictive of children's later outcomes in education and in health, and really most important, becoming a contributing member of society, whether it's voting, whether it's working, whether it's being a policymaker. We understand the value of it today because it means that our country will be better tomorrow, especially for our most marginalized communities, our children of color, children in low wealth and low resource areas. This is their lifeline in many ways.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that great discussion. I'm going to need you to impart a little bit more knowledge as we take some questions from our audience all across America. We have one really good question. This is from one of the viewers who says, one of my concerns about community-based early education is the highly variable level of training and skill of the community-based teachers and paraprofessionals. What are your thoughts on the skill and training level of early education professionals? You want to take that, Dr. Iruka?
Sure. First, I want to sort of really acknowledge our vast and diverse childcare, early childhood workforce. And while I definitely, in some ways, agree with what the audience member sent, I think we have to realize, again, the context in which many childcare providers are under, right? We are again paying $11 an hour for a workforce member who is likely not getting benefits. And so if we think about just that, but we're also expecting them to also get a BA degree and then make $11 an hour. So we have to put the whole entire childcare context into sort of a clear picture. And so I would say that there's a lot of things happening now with the childcare community, and we have to realize that some things just take a little bit more time. So for example, we know the National Academy's report several years ago really said that every child needs to have a highly competent, highly educated workforce from prenatal all the way through at least age 8. And so that means that there's a movement to ensure that everybody from the community-based childcare provider, infant toddler teachers, pre-K, et cetera, that they at least have a minimum of a BA degree. However, to get there, we have to actually be able to pay teachers and reward them for going to school and getting a BA. And we can't put the cost of that on the backs of families who are already paying a lot of money for childcare. If you think about it, many families pay more than a 4-year college tuition for childcare, especially for infants and toddlers. So I think, yes, while the childcare community, early child education could do better in terms of ensuring quality is consistent, which is happening across many states through rated license systems, through quality initiatives. HighScope has a professional coaching learning system that also connects with a lot of different providers. We do understand that when you have a system that is not fully funded, you can expect that there may not be the most perfect education opportunities. We want to also acknowledge that childcare providers, early child providers, are expected to do much more than they're paid to do. And so we can't criticize that much if we're not investing wholeheartedly in the educators themselves and also in their health and their well-being, because the best teachers are those who we take care of.
The only piece I would add is that as a public policy measure, the responsibility should be for state and local and employer-based investment in childcare, particularly for our small home-based facilities. Sometimes the solution is not to tell the woman who's been providing these services for 40 years to go back and get her BA, but it is to say that we're going to help her hire a paraprofessional who has that educational expertise to support the work that she does. And so to Ioma's point, we have to think about a way to meet the point of need now and build toward the best solution in the future. And that doesn't mean that we dismiss the need for quality education right now in home-based facilities, but that we solve the problem as we do for almost any other challenge we face. That's a public policy requirement. And that means that we have to recognize that parents cannot afford to subsidize childcare on their own. That means that there has to be state and federal investment in the provision of those services. It means that we also have to plus up, as I've said, we've got to raise wages, increase access to benefits, because we also have to start to attract new people into the profession. And they're not going to come if they don't believe that they can make a living or make a life doing this work. But we also have to meet people where they are. And that means understanding that in rural communities and communities that have mixed documentation status, that in places that have no public transportation, or in places where the entire community is basically bound to one area and they don't have the ability to travel outside or to get access to higher quality, that we have to build quality where we are meeting people at the point of their needs, and making the investment in those businesses that will also augment and improve the education of our communities.
One more live question from our audience. People want to get involved. The question is, we know the research, short-term and long-term outcomes of high quality education, but how do we shift the early childhood education issue in this country to make it a priority? How do we make it a priority? I think, Stacey, maybe this goes to the point you made about voters making this the voting issue for themselves.
When I ran for governor, I was the first candidate that we can find who actually made childcare and early childhood learning a focal point that was a standalone. It wasn't just my education policy. It wasn't just a workforce policy. It was a specific policy that looked at this issue. And I did it in part because before I ran, I spent 11 years in the legislature in conversation and in battles trying to ensure that this service was provided, that this educational necessity was recognized by my colleagues. I had done work as a consultant helping build an early childhood learning program. I did work as a legislator, and it, for me as a candidate for governor, was top of mind. But one of the ways it stayed top of mind was that those who needed it asked me about it. At every campaign stop, at every moment, I got a question about, what are you doing on this issue? I started the conversation, but they held me accountable. If you don't have legislators, if you don't have public officials who are willing to start the conversation, start it for them. And the way we start it for them is not simply by asking them directly, but also asking on Facebook so other people can see the conversation, tweeting the question at them, using social media, convening meetings, and inviting them to come to address the topic. And the reality is, if you invite someone to come and talk to you and they don't show up, that tells you something. And so part of the convening capacity in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of this election season, is that communities have the authority to bring people together to hear the questions that need to be asked, but they also have the right to ask those who currently hold leadership or want to hold leadership to come and participate. Zoom works for everyone. So to Google Hangouts, you name it, there's a way to do it. And we should be able to request of our leaders that they show up at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level to answer our questions and to tell us what their plans are. Because it's not enough to nod and say, I get your pain. I need you to tell me what your plan is to resolve it.
So I'm going to invite our panelists to just take a minute, literally, and just wrap up, give some final thoughts, some things that you would like for our audience to think, know, or do. Iheoma?
Sure. What an honor to be part of this conversation with Stacey and with Chastity. So this year marks HighScope's 50th year anniversary. For 50 years, our foundation has been working to close the opportunity gap through high quality early education, because we believe that every child has the opportunity to realize their full potential, regardless of their race, ethnicity, zip code, and circumstances. We are particularly focused on pushing actionable research forward to ensure all children are supported, especially children from marginalized and underrepresented communities. And I want to say this, so a lot of work happened behind the scenes with the HighScope team, and obviously Detroit Public Television, and in particular Tara, but also Ingrid Justice. And I sort of end with the justice part, because early childhood started with the need to ensure that children, particularly those who are from low resource communities, particularly Black children, were provided with high quality early learning experiences. And so it reminds me that for us to really meet our destination and deliver on the promise, we have to think about justice, and early childhood is really part of that justice framing. So you can learn more about how to support HighScope's research, early child curriculum and programming assessment tools, and professional development for educators by visiting highscope.org. Again, I want to say thank you so much. I've been so honored to be part of this conversation with Chastity and, of course, with Ms. Stacey Abrams.
Great. Stacey?
Iheoma, it's been my honor, and I've learned a great deal. I'm going to use some of your stats and, more importantly, some of your lines and give you no credit for it.
Okay.
I'm apologizing now. And Chastity, thank you for moderating such a thoughtful conversation. Thank you to HighScope and to Detroit Public TV. One of my favorite quotes is the line, "Give me a place to stand and I will move the world." We have to give our youngest, most underestimated children a place to stand, and that begins with early childhood education. When I was growing up, my parents were in the working poor category. My mom was a librarian, my dad was a shipyard worker. And though they had very little, they made certain that we always had access to education because they understood that education unlocked the future for us. I remember leaving our preschool, which was on my mom's the campus where my mom worked, and I would sleep in the stacks surrounded by books. The smell of books woke me up from my nap. And what I remember is just how important learning was in our family. Not just learning for the sake of advancement, but learning for the sake of enrichment. And that's ultimately what we want. We want every child, regardless of their economic background, their racial background, their documentation status, regardless of their origins, they should have the most unlimited future imaginable. And that's what this work is about. It's about saying that we believe, actually, truly believe in our people from the moment they arrive. And that investment is made real when we invest in early childhood education, we invest in the people who provide it, and when we make certain that families can access it regardless of where they begin. If we do that together, if we use that as our impetus heading into this next conversation about recovery, then we stand a chance of building the America we've always dreamed of. And that's an America that works for all. Thank you all so much for having me.
Well, whenever you talk about children, and especially our littlest ones, people get emotional and passionate. Thank you, Iheoma and Stacey, for your passion towards working towards solutions. So everyone, on behalf of HighScope and Detroit Public Television, thank you, everyone from across the country, for joining us. If you missed any part of today's conversation, you can watch it on onedetroit.org/HighScope. Please, everyone, continue to work to help all children and stay safe.